What if dyslexia isn't what you've been told? Today, we're uncovering what's really behind the reading struggles and why it matters for your child. Hello, my name is Janae Daniels. I'm a wife, a mother of six, and a former middle school teacher turned homeschool mom. Welcome to the School to Homeschool podcast. Hello, my friends, and welcome back. I'm very excited for today's guest. Today, we have Faye Bankler Casell. She is a special educator, a certified academic language therapist, and a dyslexia therapist who received her MA from Teachers College, Columbia University. After 2 decades as working as a special educator and administrator in private and public school programs, Faye is now supporting parents in the reading development of their dyslexic children through her business, homereadingcoach.com. And you can find her on YouTube and her socials as Teach My Child to Read. As a response to a growing literacy crisis in America, with many families being denied testing or dyslexia services for their child, Faye's parent-led therapist coach dyslexia program is a cost-effective way for parents to support their dyslexic child without relying solely on the school. So, Faye, thank you so much for coming
Thank
today and talking with me.
you. Thank you. And I just want to say one little thing. My YouTube,
Yes.
my YouTube channel is called Teach My Child to Read, but the socials are Home Reading Coach.
Perfect, perfect,
In
perfect.
case anybody's looking.
Yes, and which I'm gonna put all of her links in the show notes so that y'all can get in touch with her and find her.
Right.
So, we'll have that in the show notes. But let's talk about, so how on earth did you get involved with dyslexia? Like, let's talk about your journey
Sure.
into how you've gotten to where you've gotten.
Sure. So I went to graduate school, and the very first semester, I signed up to do an internship with this reading and writing program that was there. Thousands of teachers would come from all over to study. And I wanted to just get in the classroom and kind of get my feet wet. And I would come home and tell my husband they're doing the weirdest thing. Like they're teaching the kids to read, but then they'll cover the words with a post it and ask them to guess what they think the next word is and to look at the picture. And it just seems so weird, but they're the experts and everybody studies with them. And this was in New York, and the Board of Ed had spent so much money rolling this program out and getting it trained all through the school.
Was it the 3 queuing method?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. It
Oh, I
was
have feelings about that. Anyway, keep
this
going.
very famous three queuing method. And so
You can say it. It's okay. It's okay
it's
because
the
I brought
reading
it
and
up before.
writing project, the Lucy Calkins curriculum. You'd think that she was a celebrity. She was a
Yeah.
celebrity in
Yep.
my world. And so, anyway, I didn't worry too much about it because I started out in early childhood special education. So, the highest I was going was kindergarten. I was really focused on phonemic awareness, phonological awareness. So, all the letter sounds, rhyming, all that kind of pre literacy stuff. And then several years ago, when my son was born, he had a lot of developmental delays. And poor little baby had early childhood special educators. I by 1 year old, I had him in speech therapy because I recognized that he wasn't babbling. He was doing occupational therapy 3 times a week. He had a lot of developmental issues. And so I told my husband, I know that he is at risk for dyslexia. There's going to be something, and he might have reading struggles. And so I kind of was gearing up towards moving up to the elementary age. And I said, I don't know what that was that they did in graduate school, but I needed to actually teach kids how to read. So I enrolled myself in a dyslexia therapy program. But right before that, my son was in kindergarten, and he, sure enough, was having trouble reading. So I pulled on all my years of special education, the multisensory learning, the sort of things with attention and multimodalities. And I got him launched. And then I started my dyslexia therapy program. And then I heard Sold a Story, the podcast, and I was like, everything makes so much sense now. I feel vindicated.
Yep.
But so I've been working both in a public school and privately for the last
Mhm.
several years with kids with dyslexia and for a variety of reading struggles. And most recently, not recently, this has been going on for years, but it just finally hit a point where I couldn't stand it. I've just talked to enough parents who are being denied testing by a public school, which anybody is entitled to, or if their kids in public school, they're getting the test, but then not getting qualified for dyslexia services, and they're fighting for years. And then I've always been on different social media groups for families of kids with dyslexia, homeschoolers, whatever, people coming on and just, I think my kid has dyslexia. What should I do? And there's this flood of information and opinions by people
Mhm.
of I've tried this, it's the best, or you should only do this. And some of it's really evidence based and some of it's sketchy. And I just kind of had enough. so so I decided to pivot. And so what I'm doing right now is kind of a twofold approach. One is I'm just trying to give parents a roadmap towards some good information. So I have a free ebook that is called the Dyslexia Roadmap for Families, and I've sent you the link. But
Yep,
that
we'll
is,
put it in the show notes.
yeah, I just, and it doesn't have everything in the world you need to know, but it's a good start and it points parents towards here are some quality resources and things to ask and places to go to find people who are qualified. Because what I noticed is that people coming out of the woodwork, and some of them qualified, and some of them are selling things that are not your first go to for a kid with dyslexia. And then the other thing that I'm doing is I'm launching, it's called the Reading Breakthrough. And so it is me teaching parents how to do the dyslexia intervention. So I've written out the curriculum. I'm doing the video where I'm teaching the parents how to do it. And then they could opt into video coaching, to group coaching, to different things, right? I still see kids one on one, but there's a big gap, right? There's somebody with my training. I'm considered sort of low because I'm in Texas. I charge $80 an hour, but Northeast it's 120, and I do dyslexia therapy, not dyslexia tutoring. So it's a
Which
lengthy
what's the difference?
so, dyslexia therapy is a lengthy process that has a huge scope. And when they do scans and imaging on the brain, you'll actually see that new neural pathways have been formed. I'm not a dyslexia tutor, so I hope anybody who's listening out there will forgive me if I don't just do the best justice to them. But in my experience, dyslexia tutors are very skilled at plugging holes, right? And shoring up things. Whereas we are like, here's the foundation, like, here's the layering. So it's a really intensive process and it's expensive. And so many families are already picking up the slack if they're in school of, you know, where the schooling is not working with them. Many families are committed to homeschool and they want to do, they want to maintain, right, the vision for their family and be able to help their child be successful in homeschool. So yeah, I've created this program. It's not going to be right for everybody, but for people who want to teach their kids and don't want to spend $80 or $100 an hour, this is a way to meet in the middle. So I'm doing the beta launch for the first sort of piece of the program. So it's 13 weeks and about 53 sessions and it's under $100. So
That's awesome.
yeah,
That's awesome.
I just want kids to
So,
get what they need.
because I think you bring up an interesting point. One of the concerns I hear from a lot of parents who are nervous to homeschool and their kids are in public school is, well, but what if how do I get the services for my child who has an IEP or a 504 if I homeschool? Which is always makes me giggle because I'm like, well, usually on the 504 and IEP, the things that they have, a lot of the things that they're asked to do is like make sure the child's sitting in the front, make sure that you go over one or two instructions at a time, like it. And I'm like, yeah, you do that in homeschooling anyway, like you get one-on-one anyway. But then always the question comes up, but what about the services like for dyslexia? And yet you bring up an interesting point is that they've got the diagnosis, but not much is being done in the schools, which I see all the time
So
happen.
it varies. And if you look on my website, I've sort of positioned it as the teacher lottery. You could win the lottery. You could get phenomenal services, and they might be doing a really high quality dyslexia therapy program and matching the fidelity of the program, meaning that they're doing the intensity, the frequency, the duration, they're keeping the group size so that it aligns with the science, the research of the program. You could have that. It's unfortunately not as often as you would think, right? So maybe about
Right.
1 in 4 or 5 dyslexic kids actually qualifies as gets tested, gets qualified, and gets the intervention. And then you have people who are doing like 30 minutes here and there, and they did some professional development. Really is it depends on the state. It depends on the legislation. Here, I would say most families, if you're a homeschooling family and you are going to utilize the public school for testing, the benefit of that is you'll have some good information on your kid. You are going to definitely want that if they're going to college and sitting for college boards. You're going to need some really good information that because they have a higher what do I want to say? Like a higher threshold you have to meet to get accommodations on things like the SAT. And you will kind of have a nice baseline of knowing where you're starting from, which I encourage every family to have, regardless of what intervention you're doing, because you want to know that what you're doing is helping. Um, but then really the kids who get an IEP through and are at private school or homeschool, they can get dropped off to do some speech therapy maybe once a week or every other week. Sometimes for the very littles, they might have someone kind of do a little intervention with you. They'll give you access to like an online program, that kind of thing. But if you're not enrolled in the school, you're not getting dyslexia therapy, has been my experience.
Right.
So,
Well, and I think I can't speak for every state, but I know in my state, once you choose to homeschool, you're not eligible for those. You're not the kids no longer have IEPs or accommodations. Like you're homeschooling, and so they just kind of like, well, you're on your own, and they don't necessarily get those services as homeschoolers
no.
because they're taking on the education.
And that's what,
And so
yes.
and so in the case, like, for homeschoolers who which I have a couple questions with dyslexia, but this one first. When a parent might suspect that there is something going on with a child like dyslexia, where would they go? Since they can't go to the school necessarily in many states, where would they go for testing? And is that something that you offer or can provide some guidance on?
Okay, so point of clarification. Under IDEA, they can get tested by the public school
Interesting.
system, and the school system must test, and the school
Mhm.
system must offer what's called child find, meaning that they are actively looking for kids who.
Interesting.
So, what you
Is that is
that
that
is a
federal or is
federal law. That is a
interesting?
federal law.
Okay, fantastic.
Now, the way that districts go about it can be different. Every district should have kind of a child find office. Generally, in my experience in Texas schools, what would happen is you would go to the school you're zoned to. Doesn't matter that your kid isn't enrolled. You go to the school you're zoned to, you request testing, they set up a meeting, you sign consent. You're going to have to bring your child in, right, to do the testing. And that
Mhm.
could be a period of a couple of days. And they've got certain timelines, of how long they can use to test and then how long they can use to follow up. When private school families or homeschool families would come for me to test, well, I didn't do the testing, but would come and get qualified, I would present an IEP that if your child were coming to my school tomorrow, these are the things that I would recommend. This is the kind of schedule, this is the kind of goals, these sorts of things. The families would then and if they qualified for like some speech or some services through the district. I know one homeschooling family here who they're not going to get speech there, or they're not going to get dyslexia therapy through the district, but the district, once they identified her son as dyslexic, did give her like $400 to buy materials for
Wow.
homeschooling.
Okay.
And, I helped her select things, that kind of stuff. So if they have
Gotcha.
anything that they're going to offer you as a homeschooler or private school, you can do that. Some families will take that testing to go to their private school and show the school and then get accommodations through the school. The school isn't required to do that. It's a private school. They are not mandated under IDEA.
Hmm.
But there are lots of private schools that, will try to accommodate. Maybe they offer a program, maybe they don't. So you can get tested. In the dyslexia roadmap that I have, I've sort of outlined what that looks like, some ways to advocate if you're planning on utilizing their services. And then on my YouTube channel, Home Teaching Coach, I actually have a 3-part video where I interviewed former licensed school psychologists who now are private licensed psychologists and do testing privately. And so they really walked people through kind of here's what you're going to expect to experience during the testing process. Here's sort of a ballpark figure of cost. So you have the free school testing, and then you have paid testing. The paid testing is going to go a lot deeper and wider because they're psychologists. If you choose a psychologist, they're able to look at broader things like ADHD, depression, things that the school is not going to be able to test for. Um, those are sort of your choices in there. And again, if you're going to homeschool the whole time, you may not need it or want it. I always say it's free and it's out there, and it's always good to just kind of know where you're starting from. And then again, with the SATs, that kind of stuff, college, you might want it from an accommodation standpoint.
Gotcha. Now, so let's get back to the basics with dyslexia. I have to be honest, I don't know a lot about dyslexia. And I've read all sorts of things. Read everything from that there's one belief that the introduction of whole language and the removing of phonics was helped cause dyslexia, but I didn't know if that was true or not because I don't know much about it. What what do we think are the causes of dyslexia? That's the first question. The second question is, what can a parent, some telltale signs that a child
Sure,
might be dealing with dyslexia or have dyslexia?
sure. So dyslexia has always been here. As far as sort of roots, is there something biological besides genetics? Now, what we do know is it's a neurodivergence, and there have been lots of scans on brains of typical readers and dyslexic readers. And you can see the difference in the brain scans. So,
Interesting.
with your typical proficient reader, different zones in the brain are activating and coming together to do what is essentially a really unnatural process. Every culture has a language that's spoken. A lot of cultures now moved into a written language, but we're actually not wired to read, right? But we've figured it out, and
We've made it happen.
we've
Yeah.
made it happen, and it's a great thing. So, for some people, though, the regions of the brain that really are needed to be proficient readers are not operating in the way that is efficient and necessary for them to read well. So, that being said, people with dyslexia often have incredible skill sets that are like you'll meet a lot of engineers, a lot of people with like really great visual spatial thinking skills who are dyslexic. I saw this TED talk of an MIT professor, and he said that the professors there jokingly call it the MIT condition because they have such a high amount of student body that is dyslexic. So it's important to recognize, first of all, that it is a beautiful brain. For reading, it's having a lot of trouble. So for dyslexia therapy, we have to do a very explicit therapeutic approach. approach in order to get the brain activated in the way that's going to help. So the brain scans have shown that. About 1 in 5 people have dyslexia. And of that, if you're talking about a public school population, maybe only 1 in 5 of those are getting identified and labeled. So it's the highest occurring learning disability and it flies under the radar a lot still. So that was the case. When I was young, I'm not gonna group you with my age group, because I don't think so, but I don't know. But um, it was a lot of it. And even now, he can do it. He's not trying. He just needs to pay attention. He doesn't want to, So science has come a long way. Now, you raised the question about the whole language and the phonics and that sort of thing. And I haven't necessarily heard that theory that it causes dyslexia. I can tell you that what it has caused is a whole literacy crisis in public schooling in America. And so the way that a dyslexic child is taught to read that works is a way that benefits everybody and is essential for some. So there are kids who are always going to figure out how to read, right? There's like this one segment of the population.
There's the outliers,
They're
right?
always gonna figure it out. They're just gonna figure it out, right? Then there's the bulk of the kids where if you're doing quality full classroom instruction that is rooted in the science of reading, then you're going to have the majority of your classroom reading. Let's say about
Which
80.
would that be phonics specifically?
So phonics is part of it. It's not the only part of it, but yes, in science backed reading strategies, you explicitly are teaching letter sound combinations, slang patterns, the different because the reality is I can't think of the exact number, but it's something like I want to say 85% or so of English is actually totally decodable with the exception of maybe one sound in a word. Like it just keeps building.
Interesting.
So you really can, if you teach people when you hear this sound, you spell it this way, or when you read the spelling, it's going to be this way or this way. Like you explicitly teach them kind of the logic of it and the reason that it exists that way. Some of the really crazy spellings that are out there for things that like enough, could, would, those silent letters, knife, knob. There's a perfectly logical explanation of it once you delve into the history of English. So were you to teach all that, the idea would be that 80, 85, whatever, the majority of the class would get. And you don't even need to go that far into the logic of English. So we're not doing that. So what's happened is we now have close to 70% of public school kids in 4th grade who cannot read proficiently. And it's like it's flipped, the numbers have flipped. So we've taught reading wrong for so long, and it's so ingrained. It has been so ingrained in the teacher education programs. It's been rampant. And the states and the school districts and professionals and advocates are all out there trying to kind of figure it out. But what's happening is if your kid's not reading bad enough and it just all these kids that should not be requiring those higher level services are now needing that. The schools are so flooded with kids who are not proficient readers because the foundation was
It's not there.
faulty for a really long time. So yeah.
Well, and I think in the homeschool, which it's funny because you brought up Lucy Calkins. My now 24-year-old son, when he was little, came home one day and he was like, we did a parent teacher conference with one of his teachers, and she said, if he says home instead of house and the word is house, that's fine.
Hmm.
And I was like, wait, what?
No.
And she's like, we just, he can look at the picture. And he came home and my husband's like, oh, no, 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 no. This is exact. House and home are not the same word. They're not. Anyway, and so that's when we were like, okay, we're just going to work on, phonics. And at the time, my kids were public school. Like we didn't start homeschooling till 2020. And he graduated from public school. He reads great, but that was because we intervened as parents, I
Huh.
believe. But I look at the homeschooling world, and a lot of the homeschooling world has rejected a lot of the Lucy Calkins stuff, whole language stuff, and they, from what I've observed, it's very like, we are phonics people, but also it's my understanding that the homeschooling world has a much higher literacy rate than the public schooling world, and also parents are working one-on-one with their kids
100%.
and pulling in the phonics and, and sitting next, and they know their kids can't read when
Right.
they can't, or they know the kids can't spell because they're sitting with them and they're like,
Right.
"Okay, we're gonna do this again."
Right.
What I found interesting is, recently I've gone back to the McGuffey readers from the late 1870s, and I've loved the simplicity of and the straightforwardness of teaching reading. And I'm like, "Oh, how did we digress so far
Yeah.
in such a short time?"
Yeah. It's
So
really astounding. And I will say, yes, I think that there's something. Listen, in a classroom of 20 something kids and a teacher who hasn't been trained on what the signs are gets missed all the time. Home is, no matter what you're doing with your kid, home is accommodating. I knew when my daughter was a baby,
mhm.
if she was not asleep at 6 p.m., she was a monster the next day. So I rearranged the whole dinner time and everything around it. But you just naturally accommodate your kid, and and that is the beauty of homeschooling. Now, I will say some parents get very nervous when dyslexia or something comes up, in my experience, right, with homeschool parents, and want to feel like, am I doing it right? So for those folks, I think it's my mission is to make sure that they have the information so that they can feel confident and capable to do it themselves, or know where to go to get the information, that kind of stuff. But no, and conversely, so many families are choosing homeschooling since, I would say, there's always been plenty of families choosing homeschooling, but since COVID, because the thing that happened during COVID that was really interesting was teachers, parents had a window into school classrooms that they'd never had before. And so parents are seeing teachers encouraging kids to guess, right? That sort of thing. Or they're understanding that, oh, my kid actually can't read. Because one of the statistics that's scary for me, for families whose kids go to school, is, so I talked about, there's like 70% of fourth graders who cannot read proficiently. And yet 92%, I think it is, or something like 90% of Americans think that their kids are on grade level. So there's a big disconnect between parents sending their kids to school and the understanding of, is my child
Of what's
really
actually
learning and successful? So no, that is absolutely the benefit of homeschooling, is
yeah.
you've got all the
Well,
information in front of you.
that was the shocker for me, like, we pulled our kids summer of 2020, and actually the last semester, like, I really appreciated my kids' teachers. They did their best that they could online, and for me, I'm like, they're doing a good job, right? But the shocker for me was when my son, who was in 2nd grade, finished during COVID, going into 3rd grade, and that's when we had started homeschooling him. It was that summer before. And I was always told he's a great reader. He does amazing. He's the top of the class in reading. And so I pulled book. I was like, okay, this is the book I'm gonna have you read.
Mhm.
And it was like a castle in the attic. And it was labeled as like 3rd to 8th grade or something, or 2nd to 8th grade. And I said, okay, go ahead and read while I'm working with the kids, your siblings on this other stuff. And he would pretend like he was reading, and then I'd say, "How much did you read?" And he's like, "Paragraph." And I'm like, "Hmm." And then after a while, he would just stare at the book, and I'm like, "Well, what did you read about?" And he's like, "I don't remember." And so finally I sat down, I'm like, "I want you to read to me." And what I discovered is he could read the words, like he could sound out all of the
Yes.
words, but he didn't have any reading comprehension. And then so I was like, well, let's go back, and
Yes.
we dropped down the level of the book to Frog and Toad,
Great.
and then we started reading, and then now he's almost 14 and he's a fantastic reader. But here this whole time, I was one of those parents. I'm like, "No, he's reading great." But there was no comprehension.
Yes.
And I was like, "Oh." my goodness. So here's my question for you though. Like for the homeschooling parents who think that there might be something wrong, what are the signs for them to look for?
Yeah, great.
Because I see that on a lot of Facebook groups are like, I think something's wrong
Yeah,
with my child's ability to read, and I've got other kids and I've not seen this before. Could this be dyslexia? Like, what are the signs
sure.
where a parent can go, I need to go get them tested?
Yeah, and I will say that the data shows now that it can be identified with over 90% accuracy at age 5.5. Like, they don't even need to be
Wow.
taught to
Wow.
read yet. So some of those earlier warning signs, if you're starting with the really young ones, is your child recognizing letters? Most importantly, the letters in their name or their siblings' names, like the letters that are going to mean a lot to them. The letter sound correspondence, is that coming together? Notice with there's dyslexia is disruptive in the phonological processing part of the brain. So if you're reading books to kids and you're saying words that rhyme and they can't understand that it rhymes, you tell them like listen to the rhyme or and they don't get it. It's a level harder to start generating your own rhymes, but even sometimes with kids that I'm working with, second, third, fourth grade kind of ages, I'll say 3 words and which words rhyme, and they can't hear it. They cannot break the sounds apart and hear it. So, doing that, if you're playing with your kid and you say, "Guess my word," "duh, g," and they can't push it together, that's a warning sign. And then you want them to be able to pull apart cat, right? So those are some early ones. Now, once you talk about any kind of family history, the number goes from 1 in 5 to something like 60%, 40 to 60%,
Wow.
chance.
Wow.
So there's a lot there. The thing is, there's no downside to teaching them like they're dyslexic at that age because like I said, it's essential for some, but it's fine for everybody, right? It just means you're getting really explicit with the phonics and you're following a sequence, a natural sequence and using different inputs. Once they start reading, labored is an indicator. If they're reading with disfluency, if they're like, every if they're having to sound out every sound in every word, right? And they're not picking up on fluency and reading on a word reading level and progressing from there, that's an indicator. Another indicator, and this is part of the problem with the 3Qing, is a lot of times what dyslexic kids will do is they'll use the picture to guess the
Mhm.
word, or they might guess the letter. So they see that it's a home, they see H, and so they say house instead of home, which is a big, like the child's teacher was actually like teaching him to read like a dyslexic, which happened a lot during that era. And or maybe they see a picture of a pet and the text says dog, but they read it as puppy. So there's no P in that word, but they're guessing. So that's an indicator that they're not utilizing for decoding skills in an efficient way. So those are some good early indicators. A lot of times dyslexia can appear a lot like ADHD. I don't diagnose, but if the child's avoiding reading, can't remember what they read, doing basically anything to get away from reading instruction. And again, it can look like ADHD. That's a good signal right there. So those are some of the earlier signs. Now, I
Yeah, I
will
was gonna say a
say,
couple of things.
oh, I
No, please go ahead.
where there can be a disconnect is when you're talking about a child who has very high cognition, very high intelligence that is accelerated and kind of beyond your typical kiddo. They are often able to compensate and mask in such a way that it takes longer to pick up on it because
Interesting.
they are often able to memorize words and read them. Not able to decode them, but memorize. That's how it looks. That's how it looks. So, for a kid who's like that, who has that giftedness and is in, let's say, a school setting, for them, it's not going to start to fall apart maybe until about third grade when now all of the so much of the instruction is through reading. Like you're handed a book and you've got to read it, you've got to answer questions on it. So they can kind of fly under the radar a lot longer. Which is why it is really important to not look at, did they complete the tests that successfully at that young age, but actually you sit down and you listen to them read, because that's how you're going to know if they can read or not.
Well, and that's what happened to me is it was like, "You are not understand," and I read with him every night for 20 minutes during, when he was at school, but anyway. As far as things interventions that parents can do, what are some of the things you said you're coming out with this course that is affordable. Can you give some examples of things that you have the parents do to help with intervention with dyslexia?
Sure. And mine is not the only thing out there. There's another really nice home course, Barton, and it's called Barton Reading and Spelling. My only thing that I would add with Barton, right, is it's really decoding and spelling. And, dyslexia therapy is much more robust than that. So, in, let's say, a program like mine or a high quality dyslexia therapy program, you're going to have that phonological awareness. So, the breaking apart sounds, the hearing rhymes, the tying it to letters, the decoding, and then the encoding, the spelling. You're going to have, and it's going to be very systematic. So you sort of you start at really foundational stuff, and then it is cumulative, builds upon it. So I'm not going to teach them see like cat and then turn around and teach them circus. That is
Yeah.
later. Right? That soft C is later. Oh my God. I don't want to confuse you.
Blow the brain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and even the vowel A is usually like one of the later vowels I do, because that little guy is all over the place. Whereas I is got a long sound and short sound and is pretty reliable. So you have that working with grammar. A lot of, as the kids get older, we really do go into the history of English so that you can understand the logic of it. And that's where like the soft C, the soft G, it starts to make sense. The Greek based science words, that kind of stuff. A lot of work with decoding with fluency. What you will see in dyslexia therapy that you wouldn't necessarily see in a typical classroom is us teaching kids diacritical marking. So we will have them code the word. This one's going to be, I know that this one is going to be a short A because it's followed by at least one consonant, teaching them the different syllable types and word attack skills. So when I see a two-syllable word, but it's only got one consonant between the two vowels, my best bet is first I'm going to split it this way, and this vowel, that means this vowel's long. So really, it's really, I want to say directive, explicit word attack skills, so that kids kind of understand. Same thing with spelling rules, and spelling patterns. If you hear this sound and it's the end of the word, you're mostly going to spell it AY, that kind of stuff. And then, I work a lot on oral language because it's the foundation for all reading and writing. And then that comprehension piece. So I would say you're going to see a lot of, it's very systematic, it's very explicit, and it's cumulative. Then the other piece is it's multisensory. So we're not going to sit down and do a worksheet, only. I mean, we do have to read off worksheets. But you're going to see us skywriting things. You're going to see me using a lot of visual clues. I do a lot of hand gestures with kids, and you'll see them do it to themselves when they're trying to figure out how to say a word. So for example, just as a very, um, we'll wash our mouths, and vowels, for those at home, your mouth is always open for vowels and they're always voiced. You can feel your vocal cords vibrating. So that's how you know you're saying a vowel, right? Consonants, with the exception of H, but it's not voiced, it's the one outlier. the mouth closes in some way, your tongue, teeth, your lips. So, one of the things as we're reviewing, we also do lots of reviews. They just need a lot more exposure to kind of get it to the point of making it automatic. So, I'll do hand signal of like consonants close the mouth, the sound is blocked or partially blocked by the tongue, teeth, or lips. We'll watch our mouths and then we'll determine it open, close. Where does it close? What does that mean? It's consonant. Oh, you're not going to necessarily be seeing that every day, looking in mirrors and watching what your mouth's doing, feeling your mouth, that kind of stuff. So, and then I do a lot of things where if it's tactile, that's moving, that kind of thing. So, if we're in the early days of really trying to get those letters down, I might narrow the field to a certain set of letters that I know we're going to start with the sounds. And can we reach into a bag and just by touch tell what letter it is? Can I have you guess my letter just by asking yes no questions? Does your letter have curves? Is your letter a vowel? Is your letter, after M? Just using lots of different modalities to get the brain to fire up.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Okay. I wanted to ask this earlier and then I forgot the question, but I'm back. With kids, okay, so my youngest, we started working on phonics at age 5. She wasn't getting it, wasn't getting it, wasn't getting it, wasn't like, wouldn't. And part of me felt like, well, she's been slower developmentally with other things, maybe. And she had sensory processing disorder. She has sensory processing disorder. So I was like, and then at 7.5, all of a sudden, overnight, everything clicked in her brain. And she went from not being able to read to reading overnight. But I realized that was for her just when she was ready developmentally,
Mhm.
she picked it up versus somebody who it's more than it's a developmental issue. And like how do you know the difference? I guess that's my question is
Yeah.
how would I have known the difference
I
between
mean,
development
I
and
don't
dyslexia?
I don't diagnose, so I don't really feel comfortable saying this is how I would know or not, right? You would have to go to a professional, so yeah, a psychologist or somebody could maybe tell you more about that and honestly do a brain scan. I will say again, there's no harm and in teaching them in a way that like I've described that we would teach a dyslexic kiddo. And as you mentioned before, a lot of homeschoolers are doing the phonics. They're doing the things that they would be doing with me. So I kind of want to put like that a little bit to rest. If you're already doing the things, then I'm a little more comfortable with like a wait and see, is it going to click kind of thing. Whereas in a school setting, if you're not doing that in its whole classroom, I'm not good with waiting and seeing because
Just go get tested.
just do it. Yeah, because it's a law of diminishing returns. I'm sure that many of your listeners know that there are plenty of countries in the world that do not start formal reading instruction until older. And that is valid. That is not the case in the United States. So, like, a lot of people will think of dyslexia as that's when you see the letters backward, which it's not, but it is very common for dyslexics to not to get B, D, P, Q confused, right? And when you think about it, like, these are my glasses. Like this, they're still my glasses. Like this, they're still my glasses. So it can be challenging for a dyslexic kid to catch on that, when it faces this way, it's a B. When it faces this way, it's a D. When it's this way, it's a P. When it's this way, it's a Q. It's not your glasses that you're flinging around or your chair or whatever. And so there are those kinds of things. And the letter confusion tends to fall away 7.5. It's very developmentally appropriate. So I would say that for these parents, really understanding and having good resources on developmental skills, not necessarily what an American school wants you to learn, but developmental skills is going to help you a lot, right? That was the case with my son. I was on a train with him, and it was like a 4-hour scenic train ride, and at the end of the train ride, I gotta tell you, 20 people passed by me and said, "He's such a good baby. He's such a good baby." And I turned to my husband and I said, "The only reason people say a baby's a good baby is because they're quiet." And I was like, "We were here for 4 hours and he didn't babble." And I had him in speech therapy the next week, right? So
Yeah, because
because
you knew.
I knew what I was looking for. So I would say just get some quality information to know what you're looking for. And there's no harm in doing a test that's free, and there's no harm in doing explicit teaching. I think that one of the things that in this era can be really challenging is people are there's this hodgepodge Pinteresty thing that can happen, right? And I think it can be very overwhelming. And so I would encourage, if you do have concerns, to find something and stick with that. You can add in and weave in some things, but really find where you're going through kind of a scope and a sequence, and you can go back, you can like check before and check after and see if it's clicking. Because otherwise, if you're sort of pulling randomly without kind of a center core kind of curriculum piece, I think it's harder for you to be able to gauge if it's not sticking because it's not sticking, or maybe something got missed, that kind of thing.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Well, and I'm glad you brought up the European starting later because I know even in the homeschooling world, that's a little bit of a debate. Lots of homeschoolers are like, yeah, it's fine to wait to start teaching reading then. But then I've also heard other homeschoolers like, no, you've got to start at 4. They are out there because I've come against them.
Sure.
So I'm glad that you brought that up. But I also love that you brought up that when your baby was on the train, you felt it like you knew something was wrong.
Yeah.
You knew something was wrong. Because I think as moms, we've got that
Hmm.
at the same time, you know?
Yeah. And I would not honestly, it would have taken me longer if people hadn't remarked on him being such a good baby. Now, later, the first time my son clapped his hands, he was watching them and like the effort to bring them together, so I was already like going like gangbusters at that point. But 100%, I think that if there's a family history, and now a lot of times what happens nowadays is that a kid will get labeled as dyslexic, and then a parent will be like, I think maybe I'm dyslexic, because their whole life reading has been harder for them, but that wasn't a thing. I've recently sort of come across it in my family. I heard a family member read aloud and I was like, he is totally dyslexic. And then I started to notice other people in my family reading, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, we've just been compensating." So, I do think that if you know that you're dyslexic, there's a good chance your kid might be. And if your kid's struggling and then you reflect on like, "God, I really struggled too." Then maybe it's there, you know? Oh, so there's that. I think that if you're not teaching your kid to read until an older age, that's fine. I would say for those folks, really hone in on things like I know a lot of homeschoolers are big fans of Waldorf, and I was trained in Lifeways, which is sort of the early childhood counterpart. And what I love about that approach in the early years is so much oral language, so much rhyme and rhythm and hearing sounds. So if you're doing that, then it's a natural springboard into reading when you pick that up. Now, I would expect a 7-year-old to pick it up a lot faster than a 5-year-old. So again, if they're not picking it up, then you want to maybe slow down and probe deeper.
Yeah, and because then there might be something going
Hmm.
on at
Hmm.
that point. I love that. What, last bit of advice would you give, to parents?
I do think that trusting your instinct is a huge thing. Feel like I have met so many parents who are like, no, they told me not to worry about it. Do not ask your pediatrician, would be a piece of advice. They are not educators. I makes me sad that parents ask pediatricians, and I understand why you would. And it makes me mad when pediatricians give feedback on their reading because that is not like, stay in your lane. I love you. Stay in your lane, you know?
Yeah.
So
Yep.
I would say go to somebody who actually diagnoses educational things. Then I really think that the most important thing is for families to know that the whole point of reading is comprehension. And so if your kid, because I will meet parents of 2-year olds who are decoding books, and they're just, we call it word calling. Like they're saying the word, but not comprehending it. Kind of like you were saying with your son. So the goal is that they are able to take in the information that they're reading and understand. So don't be afraid to drop down skill levels because it's more important that they understand and then build from there. Sometimes families really want to push to a higher level. It can be kind of you're very proud and it's very exciting. But if it's not clicking for them, and then the flip side of that is that you also want to continue for way longer than you think you should reading aloud to your children because they are able to comprehend and enjoy and take in and learn from levels of reading that they cannot yet decode, right?
Yeah.
So those like reading chapter books and listening to audiobooks together, that kind of thing. So you really want to balance those two.
Yeah. And I'm a big proponent of like my kids are read it aloud to even as teenagers. So, and we listen to audiobooks because I believe so passionately in reading aloud.
Yes.
So I love that. Okay, there was one last thing I wanted to ask, and that is, what is one thing that I have not asked you that you wish I would have asked you?
Honestly, I feel like you hit the major things. I will say this. I will say that for families who have any kind of questions in their brain, please just grab my roadmap because it will start you somewhere. Do not go to the internet as your first resource, please. Because my little heart can't stand it when I see people give you answers that are wrong. I mean, I can only dive into the conversation so much. And I know that there are a lot of us out there that are trying to get you accurate information. So start with really good resources. And certainly my roadmap points parents towards valid national resources. And again, I'm just repeating what I said, but I think just
I love it. I love it.
establish a baseline, just kind of get a sense of, okay, this is where we are, so that you can really track because that's the point in teaching your child is are they progressing? And you need to know where you're starting from. So those are my two big.
I
Please,
love that. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And then I'm going to have all of your links
yes,
in the show notes, but best way to get a hold of you and find your stuff would be at www.homereadingcoach.com. Is that correct?
that's correct. And
Fantastic.
the email
Fantastic.
is Faye, Faye, at homereadingcoach.com. And I do
Fantastic.
work one on one with families and kids. I do consults, so they can always reach out if they need to.
Well, and I'm excited about your reading breakthrough course for that to come out. So I will have links to that in all the show notes so you can check out all of her resources. Mamas and papas, grandmas and grandpas, you are doing so much better than you think you are. You got this. We will talk next week. And Faye, thank you for
Thank
taking the time
you.
with us
Thank you so
today. Thank
much.
you. Thank you. Thank you.